something that inspired me to kind of think about these speculative methods, something I've come across actually from some researchers on the Edinburgh programme. So maybe I'll just kind of quickly, for those of you who don't know about the hackathon, maybe describe it a little bit, and then I can explain a little bit why it's inspired me to look a little bit more into speculative methods. So the hackathon is actually a series of events I've been organising with Jacopo, my colleague, and the first aspect of it is a series of events through it. And the first one is the kickoff event on the 30th of November, so actually coming up quite soon. And the aim for this event was really to invite people to develop something, or maybe it could be a visualization, or it could be kind of a prototype application, or whatever it might be. And we have some data, actually, some anonymized data that we can actually work with for that, some educational data. So one of the aspects of the hackathon really, and one of the reasons why we've got the second event for you to devise an idea or project to be pitched, really we wanted the hackathon to be open not just to coders or people with perhaps technical abilities, but we really wanted it to be a bit more open than that, and also to kind of integrate reflection and critical reflection and reflection on ethics and other issues into the hackathon event as well. So we wanted to kind of create different events where people can jump into. So it's not that you would necessarily need to go to both of these events, but it might be you are a coder who wants to join up with other people who are maybe studying philosophy of technology or something along those lines, or it might be you have an idea as kind of early or prototype as it might be, but you want to perhaps pitch it. So the idea is that students, researchers, kind of anyone really can go along to either of these events, and then they would later pitch or present something they've developed, be it an idea or something perhaps more like a visualization or some kind of application later on. So as I mentioned, really what we wanted to do was incorporate critical reflection into this whole process as well. So rather than just perhaps develop something which is without any kind of consideration of ethics or something like that, but we wanted to kind of incorporate reflections into that. So reflect on questions perhaps like do data-related practices cause you concern, and in what ways? How do people, be it the actual students in the project or maybe students who will be using this prototype, how do they feel about algorithmic processes being a part of their education, or automation being a part of this? And how would they approach or consider ethics in the development of the application? So they're just some of the kind of the critical reflections we wanted to incorporate and kind of encourage participants in the hackathon to get involved with these questions. So we also wanted to not limit the hackathon purely to something which might work now, something which is like a current possibility and is very certain, but also we wanted to encourage speculation on what might be possible in the future. It sounds quite difficult, but I think this is where speculative methods come in. So we really wanted to encourage people to be open-minded and encourage critical reflection on those future possibilities as well. And so, as I mentioned, I'm actually a digital education master's student, and I've been particularly inspired actually by one of the researchers on the program, Jen Ross, who's been working with many other researchers actually on speculative methods over the past kind of decade or so. And actually the timing for this event and for this book launching was quite convenient, because actually this book has just launched in the past kind of week or two. And actually there's a launch event coming up on the 1st of December. Happy to provide details about that. But yeah, it was really interesting to be able to dip into this book a little bit as it's literally just come out. So today, I think for the presentation, I don't want to talk for too long. I just wanted to really scratch the surface on some of the ideas from this book and from some of the related research, and then perhaps focus on some of the aspects which are relevant to the hackathon in particular, or maybe that might be of interest for researchers in general. So the first thing, just to introduce, what's a speculative approach and why might we consider taking one? So the speculative approach kind of comes actually not from digital education necessarily, but from the fields of art, design, critical design, human-computer interaction, and the social sciences. And actually one of the books which is quite interesting maybe to have a look at is this one by Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby. and it had some really nice, interesting examples. And it's called Design Fiction Social Dreaming. But really, it kind of sums up what speculative design is, or what it aims to do, is to really open up new perspectives on what are sometimes called wicked problems, to create spaces for discussion, to create debate about alternative ways of being, and to also inspire and encourage people's imaginations to flow freely. So it's really to be as open-minded as possible, and to have maybe some frameworks and different examples about how you might explore those alternative possibilities and future possibilities. And what Jen Ross and others have been doing over the recent years is bringing these kind of ideas, this speculative design, into digital education research. And just to kind of maybe talk about the kind of the point of departure that that Jen Ross is coming from. So Jen Ross has argued in some of the research that she's done that perhaps the kind of the what works now is perhaps has dominated educational research in the past, perhaps. So maybe the kind of themes of this kind of idea of what works might be the kind of a one-size-fits-all approach, or something that is known, something that is certain, predictable, and maybe focusing on kind of enhancement and efficiency of those things. So that's really what kind of where Jen Ross starts from. And I think really what she's doing is trying to kind of explore more this kind of concept of not yetness, which we'll go into a little bit more in a moment. But really the emphasis for this is on emerging technologies, so things that are not yet fully researched, that are unknown, and really being open-minded about those kind of things, and being open-minded to the way they might surprise us, and being curious to that complexity, because I think some of these future emerging technologies can be really complex, and we might not even know how to kind of approach the analysis of such things as well. So working with that not yetness concept, actually it's not actually like a new concept. It's actually been used in other contexts such as philosophy, existentialism, Marxism, political social sciences, and queer theory. But really, I think for the purposes of this, I think not yetness could be seen perhaps as a lens for critically and productively exploring these emerging technologies. And I think really what Jen Ross is kind of emphasizing is that it means kind of engaging with complexity, engaging with risky, unpredictable aspects. We're not kind of focusing on minimizing or resolving these kind of factors, these factors of risk, but really seeing them as necessary dimensions of technologies which are unknown and changing, in flux, emerging all the time. I think really the aim of this kind of not yetness concept is that it could be seen as a lens for critically and productively exploring emerging educational technologies. And there's this idea of the kind of not yet fully understood, and it's not yet fully researched, which I think is an important aspect. So to summarize on kind of, that introduction to speculative approaches, I think really the aim of them is that they envision and craft futures or conditions which may not yet currently exist. And really the aim is to kind of provoke new ways of thinking and to bring particular ideas or concepts or issues into focus. So we're going to go into a little bit more of the concrete of what that might look like in practice. But really that kind of sums up what the idea behind the kind of the speculative approach is. It can mean lots of different things in different contexts and in different fields, but I think hopefully that sums up what the aim is and kind of what that means in the context of digital education research. So what might a speculative approach look like in practice? So I'm going to take some of the concepts or the categories that Jen Ross sort of outlines, and then we'll go into some examples of that in a moment. But really there's kind of a couple of categories that that she highlights, and the first of those is that researchers can actually build speculative objects. So this might be something digital, something physical, but the idea is that participants would engage with that, and that would open up questions or some kind of analysis of some kind, and maybe it would uncover some unpredictable aspects which could then be analysed or could inform future research. So the second one as well is that research participants themselves could generate prototypes. It could be prototypes in a very loose term. So it could be some events or activities that researchers have designed where participants can generate some kind of speculative material, some kind of material that could be speculated on, could be analyzed, or maybe the process itself could uncover some interesting aspects and some questions. And the third category is the creation of speculative outputs or analysis. Very broad again, but it could be really broad based on some kind of research data. And we'll go into examples. So we're going to go into a couple of examples of these. And the first one being the Learning Analytics report card. Just a note to say all of these are really kind of a presentation in themselves. They're published papers, and I can share all of the kind of the links and the papers for these later. But I'm just going to really dip into a couple of these examples, and then maybe hopefully this will kind of inform some of the discussions that we'll go into next. So I'm lucky actually that as I'm a student of the program, I've actually got to play with some of these projects and be a participant in some myself. So I can actually show a little bit of my own data as well, which is perhaps of interest. A lot of these projects, including the Learning Analytics report card, are very much prototypes. So they're not kind of like fully working things that would necessarily be used in a production environment or anything like that. It's really to kind of provoke questions. And the Learning Analytics report card was a project quite a few years ago now, whereby there was an application that was developed based on real student data. So it was actually primarily from the Moodle environment, actually. So actually, we as students were all interacting in the Moodle environment in some way. And data such as kind of login times and how we interacted with the discussion forums and things like this was taken. And then actually a report card was generated. So it was very much an early prototype, but actually used natural language generation to say some insights, which the students themselves, and this is the kind of key part, the students themselves played with their own data. So maybe I can actually just quickly show you. So this is actually the application as it looked. It's very sort of simple, but essentially you selected the course that you were taking, and this is the course that I did quite some years ago. You select the dates, and then you can select between lenient, moderate, and strict, which all kind of affects the way the report is presented and the language of it as well. And then there's some different kind of factors as well that you can select to be included in the report: attendance, engagement, social interaction, performance, and personal. So it's a fairly simple thing, and this was kind of my report from quite some years ago. And I've got here as a point of comparison the strict report and a more lenient report. But essentially, it generates some kind of short sentences, some short paragraphs based on that data. And really the aim is not so much that this would be used, but more the reflections that came out of it, and the way the students sort of interacted with those reports and reflected on those reports was kind of a key aspect of the project. You can see the sort of it's fairly kind of primitive in terms of the way it reports, some metrics, but some kind of aspects of it kind of detects in some way that I'm perhaps concerned about what others in the class think about me. But most of my forum posts have been sort of neutral, so it uses some kind of analysis of the language there. And then there are some differences in the way it reports in terms of kind of whether it's a lenient or a strict report, in terms of the sort of the tone and the language it uses. So this was the report. But really what kind of went with this was the critical reflections. So from that, students were additionally asked to reflect on some of these questions and maybe write some discussion posts on it. So this was actually kind of integrated into a course. It was part of a course we were studying. During a week of that, we were asked to reflect on the use of kind of, where it's particularly sort of around learning analytics, but more broadly kind of datafication of education. And some of these questions that came out were kind of, does the report accurately reflect you, of how you feel you kind of participated in the course? Do you feel in control of the process? Given that you can kind of choose, there's some aspect where you can choose what data is included and the way it's presented, and how does it make you feel, essentially? And what do you feel about institutions collecting, storing, utilizing this data. So the data is not used in any way. Really, the project was a prototype to then speculate on how students feel about that, essentially. That was the first example. So second example, this is an example really of research participants generating something, so generating some prototypes. So this was a series of participatory workshops where speculative prototypes were developed. Let me show you kind of a quick screenshot. Sorry about the quality of that. But essentially, there were some participatory workshops where some speculative ideas were generated, which potentially would then develop into prototypes. But really, it was all based around kind of those workshops developing something to do with automation. So possible use cases. So I think about kind of 80 or 90 use cases were generated for automation in a future university. Some of those were developed into working prototypes, as I mentioned, but essentially that was put into a paper, and then some analysis of that was generated. So that was another example of how research participants generating some prototypes could then inform some analysis and some interesting speculations on that. So an example of the third category, so creation of speculative outputs or analysis. This was another one I actually took part in. So this was where students, typically students, but there are actually some others as well, participants in general, were asked to curate a playlist of music, which was conducive to their study in some way. So very, very broad brief, but essentially what the students, participants were asked to produce was a playlist of music with some liner notes and reflections on that. So I can actually show you the website here. Which was produced. This was James Lamb who focused on this, and there's actually a paper that came out of this. But essentially, all of these are different playlists of music, and you can kind of click on those, and there's some reflections on that. And really, the aim for this was really to kind of focus on the kind of the use of algorithms as well in these learning spaces. So if we're using kind of typically quite a lot of people use Spotify or similar streaming services, and how did that inform the choice of their playlist? There was some reflection in that as well. This was kind of also linked to a course that James Lamb teaches on, Education Digital Cultures, where the reflection, where there's kind of typical reflection on the use of algorithmic processes in education. So, maybe what your YouTube algorithm informs you to watch, things like that. So there was a paper that came out of this, which really kind of revealed some questions and some analysis around the role of those algorithms and platforms, and how that's kind of broadly linked to kind of what we might call learning spaces in an online setting. So that's the third example. The next aspect I wanted to just touch on quickly, and then I think maybe we'll stop for some questions and maybe have a little bit of discussion about how these ideas may or may not, in the case, as the case may be, inform your research or maybe the hackathon ideas. So the next aspect that Generos introduces is this idea of the speculative objects to think with. So I think really this is part of the book that she has produced, and it's building on all the kind of categories and concepts and examples that I've mentioned, and also drawing on Seymour Papert's concept of an object to think with, which so he used it to kind of describe his development of a programming language and a computational thinking device for children. But anyway, she uses this concept to really describe it as a speculative object to think with. Could be something material or something digital, something which participants or respondents can engage or produce speculatively. So I think Generos's work really brings us to digital education, and she describes this object to think with as possibly something technology related or computing related. It could take the form of low-tech wireframes or even stories or models, or possibly more sophisticated coded or otherwise functional objects. And then she goes into some examples of what this might actually look like. A couple more examples on speculative objects to think with. The first one being this teacher bot. This was done about actually now 7 years ago, or more actually. So actually a teacher bot. So like a Twitter-based teacher bot that kind of interacted with an actual MOOC. So there was a MOOC that was run by Edinburgh. I think it was on the edX platform or something like that. And the Twitter Teachable actually participated in the MOOC. So it was actually kind of programmed in some way. There was actually, I can show you the kind of configuration. So this was kind of coded to respond to different keywords and maybe kind of tweet out certain aspects, which would then be included in the hashtag for the MOOC. And essentially, the idea of this was it was kind of obviously quite risky. It was kind of in public, but it also kind of provoked questions about automation in education. And there was a paper that came out of that, which drew on some post-human ideas to analyze the kind of the role of where kind of automation and kind of robots and non-humans might kind of interact with education. So that was the first example. And the next one, again, I interacted with this as well, and I can show you it in a second. So there was actually a website that was created which collected some stories, some anonymous stories, which were related to data and surveillance. And I'll just quickly show you this. There were kind of three aspects to this. First of all, there were some prompt questions, and then you were able to map those questions or the answers to those questions that you gave. You were able to kind of map them and connect them together. And then you were also able to kind of write some stories. So this was the website that was produced, and there was an event as well where kind of anyone could attend. And you can see here there are some different kind of questions. And the idea is that you kind of, this spurs you to write a story, or it could be a fictional story, or it could be something speculating on a future possibility related to data and surveillance. So I don't think you can see the drop down here, but some of the questions were who is being scrutinized, what technologies enable the scrutiny, what are the benefits, what might trigger an action or intervention related to some kind of educational technology. And then you were able to also kind of add different aspects. So the different answers that you gave to some of those questions, you're able to add and maybe link together and map in this little tool. And then finally, you were able to write some stories. So I think I should be able to show you some of these stories here, and I can provide all the links for this as well. But these were some of the different stories that were created, something reflecting on kind of Microsoft Office, and kind of some either kind of experiences, or maybe sometimes people actually gave some specific kind of fictional stories, so using not kind of themselves in this story, but possibly a fictional character, and then that kind of was all fed into a paper essentially on this tool. But the idea really being that it will provoke some questions around data and surveillance, and this tool would hopefully kind of spur that. So I've taught now for quite a while, so I just wanted to maybe leave it there for a second, and maybe see if there are any questions or reflections, or maybe even if we could go into a bit of a discussion around how or if we might employ some of these speculative approaches in our own research, and maybe how this could inform the hackathon events as well. So yeah, thank you very much for bearing with me while I work through the presentation. And yeah, I'm happy to kind of take any questions, or maybe we could have a bit of collaborative discussion about how some of those approaches might be relevant for you.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Questions? Speculations?
Yes. So I'm aware this is quite a it's quite difficult to kind of put your to pin down some of these, because it's obviously quite unpredictable in some of the outputs of some of these things, and I only can really scratch the surface in terms of some of the examples, but hopefully yeah, I can provide some of the links afterwards, and you can see what some of the analysis might look like in practice, because it can be quite difficult to dip into. But I think yeah, so a lot of these kind of projects really did provoke some interesting questions. But yeah, so is anyone with questions?
I have a question. Yesterday we had a discussion. There is a project at TU Delft for ethics education, and what they did or what they used is also for interventions, basically tinkering with classical objects, either letting the students modify these objects or create different prototypes from the lecturer side, and uses in interventions to create different perspectives onto objects. It's inspired also by a talk from a TED talk from a person modifying a wheelchair, basically to have a different perception of the people around them. So my first question is like, how far do you see for the hackathon also, like, is a data set also something you can like draw different perspectives? So how do you see a data set as an artifact, and how would you tinker with that? Or so I'm not sure about that. That's one question.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really interesting, kind of like the question is, how do you speculate on something that hasn't happened yet, when there's obviously no particular kind of data set as such for that, because it hasn't happened in a sort of traditional kind of data set that you might think of. So I think, and also the kind of obviously ethical concerns if you're kind of using so-called kind of real data. So there's all these kind of things to grapple with. So I think what was quite interesting, to maybe come back to the learning analytics report card, which was quite an interesting example where in a sense, the ethical concerns, it was using kind of real data. So that was kind of a data set that existed. Essentially, was extracting data from Moodle. It was fairly sort of, limited data just on things like kind of login time, participation in discussion forum posts, the kind of typical stuff that you can take from, Brightspace, Moodle, other platforms. But I think it really did lead into some more critical reflections around that. And also, because this was very much a prototype, it wasn't kind of used in practice. It allowed students to play with their own data as well. So only they could see their own data, and they chose what to share in the discussion forum posts that were part of the course. It was actually integrated into an education course as well. And yeah, so I think basically this is one example of how a data set could be used. So obviously your own data that only you have access to, but then you can choose what you share, and you can reflect on it critically, and then that in a sense produces new data, which can then be analyzed. So maybe that's one example of how these kind of approaches can produce perhaps new insights, new data from existing data sets. That's kind of one example. I guess another example of a data set was the kind of slightly more risky, if I just skip through to, the teacher bot. So that by the nature of it, because it was essentially like a real MOOC that was occurring, but there was a Twitter bot that was interacting with that course in a way. So that kind of generates data in terms of how people respond to that, in terms of the different ways in which it responds as well. And so that kind of obviously generates data as well. So did that answer your question, Marcus, in terms of kind of how data sets might fit into that? I guess it depends.
It starts some thinking processes, absolutely, yes.
Yes, yeah. So these kind of approaches can be very different in terms of, it could be utilizing some data from an existing course, as I've shown in some of the examples like the learning analytics report card, or it could be that if I go back to the example where actually research participants generate something. So they generate maybe prototypes, use cases for automation. So that in a sense is kind of not so much a data set as such, but more kind of participants generating their own prototypes, which could then be developed into something that's like a working prototype. But lots of kind of reflections, obviously, and interesting reflections along the way in creating that. Yeah, so it could be kind of researchers generating something which would analyze student data, or it could be research participants themselves co-creating something with the researchers. Yeah, so it can be kind of any number of things, basically, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, thanks, Michael, for your great presentation. I'm a bit speculative about the quality of the data set. however, so I do wonder, like, what are the current measurements or the criteria that are being used to measure the data, or like, or if you have like implemented certain kind of like intervention or in experiments, like how afterwards you measure the usefulness and like the or what you measure at the end. There are basically two questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So so I'll try and maybe address the sort of aspect of kind of what might constitute useful or reliable data. So I think typically the approach that many of these projects take is that the analysis that's developed is fairly possibly subjective, or it kind of maybe utilizes some concepts from like post-humanism and so on. So really the kind of analysis, a lot of the analysis that's produced from this is kind of written. It's not trying to sort of necessarily say there's generalizable data that's produced in all cases, but mainly to provoke reflections. So it's kind of really taking more of a sort of perhaps a social sciences approach, and drawing kind of aspects from maybe from philosophy, sometimes some kind of sociology and other fields, in order to kind of provoke questions. And sometimes, yeah, that might involve prototypes, but I think on the whole, although, you know, I'm sure there are examples that would prove me wrong, but on the whole, a lot of these projects might not necessarily focus on generalizable data. And I think some of these projects might actually use quite small data sets as well, because of the kind of experimental nature of what they're sort of attempting. It might be that they only have a couple of participants or something like that, but maybe the process itself is worthy of being written about. So sometimes in this kind of research, I guess, maybe the point of the sort of the paper and the insights you get from it is kind of perhaps more on the methods themselves, perhaps necessarily than producing some sort of generalizable data. Although it can certainly be interesting what is produced, but I think quite often the aim is not to produce some generalizable insights. I think it's mainly to focus on kind of like some experimental methods, like how might we go about you know, reflecting on these concepts and so on and so forth. So I hope that kind of answers your question. I think it's quite tricky to give a criteria as such on what might produce something that's useful. I think because a lot of this is quite new, you know, the speculative approaches, it's obviously drawn from other fields like critical design and so on. But I think the main aim of this is really to focus on how can we reflect on things that haven't happened yet, and how can we sort of critically engage with that. Maybe kind of one final point as well. Sorry, did you have a question?
Yeah. I just act with your thoughts. I think yes. In a way, I think it's more explorative research process that you try to bring up like more reflections and like what are the possibilities there. But the reason why that I ask this is like there's also the very much discussed topic in the research field that like how do we ensure the quality of the research regardless of the data, or like in a lot of aspects. So that's why I raised this question here, and also that's what I'm interested in. So yeah, thanks a lot for your answer.
Yeah, no problem at all. Yeah, and maybe just to add one thing that came to mind. So quite often speculative approaches is really, really broad, and there's obviously some subcategories that I've mentioned, but that's by no means the kind of the only subcategories, I guess. I think it might kind of utilize other frameworks that exist as well. So for example, some of the data that might be produced around a kind of maybe this one, for example, I've got on the screen here. So you know, where research participants generate some prototypes. There's the option also possibly of combining it with other frameworks as well. So there's obviously, you know, many kind of frameworks through which you can analyze technologies from an ethical perspective, many kind of competing ones. and it's not necessarily this will be the only kind of approach. It could possibly inform future analysis as well. Or maybe one of the other things that is quite interesting is to kind of reveal new questions. So I think some of this might open up new questions for future research as well. This particular approach, researcher Dana Boyd, who describes kind of an ethnographic approach whereby you don't start necessarily with a rigid set of research questions per se, but really you kind of, as you say, it's more kind of explorative, and maybe you might reveal the questions you might want to actually ask from these exercises. But yeah, so that's maybe just an extra point to add on there. So there's no kind of one way to kind of one size fits all for kind of the speculative approach, but maybe it kind of might reveal new questions or open up new questions for future research as well.
Yeah. Other questions, or otherwise then thanks again a lot, Michael, for being with us. We've been recording the session, and we'll share with you the form for consent, and then internally or publish it. Thank you very much.
No problem at all. Yeah, no, thank you very much, everyone. And yeah, I'll share all the this Miro board as well. And yeah, do feel free to let me know if you like any links for the different examples as well.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay.